Diana Thornton pressed her palm flat against the cold train window and bit down hard on her lip until she tasted blood. The ring, the one she'd worn for 6 months, the one she'd shown her mother with trembling, tearful pride, was gone. She'd dropped it off the St. Louis platform before boarding, watched it tumble between the wooden planks and vanish, and felt nothing. No relief. No freedom. Only the hollow, suffocating weight of a woman who had done everything right and still lost every single thing. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The westbound train out of St. Louis smelled like coal smoke and damp wool and other people's secrets. Diana Thornton sat with her back rigid and her hands folded in her lap, fingers laced so tightly her knuckles had gone white 20 minutes outside the station. She had chosen the seat deliberately window side rear of the car closest to the wall. She had pulled her hat brim low and angled her face toward the glass and made herself as small as a woman of her height could reasonably manage. She was not small by nature. She had never been the kind of woman who shrank. But nature had very little to do with what Diana Thornton was doing now. She was surviving. That was the only word for it. Not traveling, not returning. Surviving the way a person survives the moment after something collapses. Still breathing, still upright, still moving, but not entirely sure why. 6 months ago, she had left Nevada with her mother's blessing and her father's careful, restrained nod of approval and a trunk full of her best dresses. She had gone to St. Louis on the arm of her engagement, which is to say, she had gone to St. Louis because of Preston Halliwell, because of his letters, his careful penmanship, his promises that had arrived once a week like clockwork and smelled faintly of cedar and ambition. Preston Halliwell of the St. Louis Halliwells. A name that meant something in that city. A name that was supposed to mean something for Diana too by extension. Her mother had said so. Her aunt had written it in a letter. Even her father, who was not a man given to optimism, had said quietly one evening, "This could be a good thing for this family, Diana. Don't waste it." She had not wasted it. She had gone to St. Louis, and she had behaved impeccably, and she had met Preston's mother and his associates, and she had smiled until her face ached and said the right things, and worn the right dresses, and been by every measurable standard exactly what was expected of her. And then she had walked into the parlor of Preston Halliwell's home on a Tuesday afternoon when she was not expected until Thursday, and found him with his hands on the shoulders of a woman named Clara Beaumont. And Clara Beaumont's laughter had stopped the moment Diana appeared in the doorway, and Preston had turned around very slowly, the way a man turns when he already knows what he's going to find. Diana had stood there for exactly 3 seconds. She had counted them later lying in her rented room with the ceiling pressing down on her. 3 seconds of silence in which Preston Halliwell's face had moved through several expressions. Surprise, then irritation, then something cold and calculating that she would spend months trying to forget. Then he had said, "Diana, this isn't what it appears." And she had said, "Take the ring back, Preston." And he had said very quietly, with Clara still standing behind him and the fire crackling in the grate, as if nothing in the world was wrong, "You're being hysterical." That was the word that undid her. Not the betrayal itself, though, that had carved something clean out of her chest, left a gap that the cold air moved through. Not Clara Beaumont, who had the decency at least to look ashamed. It was that word. Hysterical. Delivered in that tone, that carefully measured tone that said, "I am the reasonable one here, and you are the problem." Diana had removed the ring and set it on the mantelpiece. She had not thrown it. She had not raised her voice. She had turned and walked out of Preston Halliwell's house, and she had written him a letter that was 2 sentences long, and she had expected that to be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Preston Halliwell's version of events spread through St. Louis society with the efficiency of a grass fire. In his version, Diana Thornton was unstable. She had arrived uninvited. She had made accusations. She had made a scene. She had been above all things difficult, which was the word polite people used when they meant something worse. By the time Diana had packed her trunk and arranged her ticket home, she had received 2 notes, canceling social engagements. One visit from Preston's aunt, who sat across from her in the parlor with a smile that never touched her eyes, and suggested that Diana might want to reflect on her behavior, and a letter from her own mother in Nevada that said, among other things, "I don't understand what you did to cause this, Diana. I don't understand at all." Her mother did not understand. Her father had said nothing yet, which was sometimes worse. And so, Diana Thornton had boarded the westbound train with her trunk and her hat pulled low, and the particular grinding shame of a woman who had been wronged, and then somehow made responsible for the wrong. She was staring at the flat brown landscape, moving past the window, trying to make her mind go quiet, when the car door opened and let in a blast of air that smelled like distance and dry grass, and boots hit the floorboards with the particular weight of a large man who was not trying to be subtle about it. She didn't look up. She heard him pause somewhere near the middle of the car. She heard the low exchange as he spoke to the conductor. Then the footsteps came closer and stopped, and a voice said, "Beg your pardon, ma'am. That seat taken." She looked up then, because she had to. He was tall the way men who have spent years outdoors tend to be tall, not just in height, but in the way he occupied space, like the air around him had made accommodations. His hat was dark brown and trail-worn. His coat was canvas, not fashionable. His face was tanned and angular, somewhere in his early 30s, by her reckoning, with dark eyes that were looking at her, not with the particular invasive curiosity she had been enduring for 3 days, but with simple, patient inquiry. Just a man asking about a seat. Every other seat in the car was occupied. She could see that from where she sat. "No," she said. "It's not taken." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat briefly, not a show of it, just a gesture that had become automatic, and settled into the seat beside her with the unhurried ease of a man who had sat down in a great many places and never once worried about what anyone thought of it. He set a saddlebag on the floor between his boots. He angled his hat back slightly. He looked out the window for a moment, and then he said without turning his head, "Caleb Xavier, heading to Carson City." Diana blinked. It was such a plain thing to say. No preamble, no apology for sitting beside her, no assessment of whether she wanted conversation. Just a name and a destination offered the way you offer a person your hand simply, without calculation. "Diana Thornton," she said after a beat. "Rawhide." "That's a good town," Caleb Xavier said, and looked back out the window, and that was all. For a long while neither of them spoke, and Diana discovered with a startlement she hadn't expected that the silence he carried was different from the silence she'd been sitting in alone. Her silence had been the kind that pressed. His was the kind that breathed. She became aware gradually that the two women sitting across the aisle had been watching her since St. Louis. She had noticed them at the station, a mother and daughter, well-dressed, Midwestern in the particular way that telegraphed propriety. The mother had a sharp face and the kind of eyes that moved quickly cataloging. The daughter was perhaps 19 and had been stealing glances at Diana with the undisguised fascination of someone who had been told something interesting about her. Diana knew what they had been told. She had heard it from enough angles by now to recognize the shape of it. The mother leaned toward the daughter and said something behind her glove, and the daughter's eyes cut to Diana and away again. And Diana felt her jaw tighten in the old familiar way, the way that meant she was about to have to decide whether to pretend she hadn't noticed or acknowledge it and deal with what came next. Caleb Xavier said, still looking at the window, "You know those women?" Diana was startled. "No," she said. "They seem to know you." "They know something about me," Diana said carefully. "Or they think they do." He turned and looked at her, then fully for the first time, not in appraisal, not in judgment, but with a direct level attention that was somehow less unsettling than she would have predicted. "That bother you?" he said. "It did 3 days ago," Diana said. "Now I'm mostly just tired." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she would have closed off immediately at pity. Something more like recognition, the way a person looks when you've said something they've felt themselves and hadn't expected to hear out loud. 3 days is a long time to carry something heavy, he said. "Yes," Diana said, "it is." He nodded once and looked back at the window, and Diana realized she had said more to this man in 3 minutes than she had said to anyone in 3 days, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. The afternoon wore on. The landscape shifted the dense, cluttered geography of Missouri, giving way to something wider, something with more sky in it, and Diana felt something in her chest unclench by a fraction that she hadn't known was clenched. She had grown up with sky like this, wide and pale and indifferent in the best possible way, not hostile, not judging, just there. She ate nothing. She had not eaten since the previous morning. Her stomach had been a closed fist for days. But she drank the water from her canteen, and she watched the land go by, and she became slowly, reluctantly aware that the presence beside her was not uncomfortable. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the woman across the aisle, the mother, raised her voice just enough to carry in the way some people raise their voice when they want to be overheard without being obvious about wanting to be overheard. "I do think," the woman said to her daughter, "that some women simply invite trouble. It's a matter of character, really. You make your choices, and then you live with what follows." Her daughter said something low and soft that Diana couldn't catch. "Precisely," the mother said with a tight little smile. "No one forces a woman into a situation. She puts herself there." Diana's hands had gone flat against her thighs. She was staring at the window. She was breathing. She was doing that deliberately, counting it in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was 11 years old and first learning what it meant to be a woman in a world that had opinions about women. Caleb Xavier shifted in the seat beside her. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He turned his head toward the aisle very slowly, and he looked at the woman across from them with an expression that was absolutely calm and absolutely unambiguous. The kind of look a man gives when he has decided something and there will be no further discussion. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that was quiet enough that only the people nearby would hear it. "I don't know what you think you know, but I'd let it rest if I were you." The woman opened her mouth. "Let it rest," Caleb said again with the same measured quiet, and there was something in the repetition that made the instruction very clear. The woman closed her mouth. She turned back to her daughter. She did not speak again in a voice designed to carry. Diana stared at the window. Her throat had gone tight. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "She'll say whatever she likes when she gets where she's going." "Probably," he agreed. "So it doesn't change anything." "Changes something," he said, and he said it simply, without argument. And Diana found she didn't have a response to that, so she said nothing. After a moment she said, "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Caleb said. He picked up the saddlebag, checked something inside it, set it back down. "You eat today?" The question was so ordinary that it took her a moment to process it. "No," she said. He reached into the saddlebag and produced a piece of cloth folded into a rough square and handed it to her without ceremony. Inside were 2 hardtack biscuits and a strip of dried venison. "It's not much," he said. "It's something," Diana said, which was a true thing, and she took it. She ate slowly the way a person eats when they've forgotten eating is something they're allowed to do. The food was plain and a little hard, and it was the best thing she had tasted since St. Louis, not because it was good, but because it was given without conditions. The sun was lowering by the time she spoke again. "You said Carson City," she said. "That's right." "You have people there." "Ranch," Caleb said. "Outside of Carson City. Been building it 3 years." He paused. "Cattle mostly. Some horses." "You run it alone?" "Got 2 hands," he said. "My foreman's been with me since the beginning. Good man. Name of Ruiz." He said it with the ease of someone who respects the people he works with and doesn't feel the need to qualify it. "It's not a big operation, but it's mine." "That's worth something," Diana said. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "It is." She looked at him sidelong. In the fading afternoon light, the angles of his face were sharper, the tiredness around his eyes more visible. He was not a man who looked like he'd had an easy life, and yet he also did not look like a man who was bitter about it. That distinction Diana thought was harder to come by than most people realized. "You from Nevada originally?" she asked. "Wyoming," he said. "Moved west about 5 years ago." He was quiet a moment. "After my wife passed." Diana said nothing immediately. She understood the weight of that pause the way a person says something like that, not to invite sympathy, but because it's simply a fact of who they are, a coordinate on the map of their life that explains other things. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said, and she could hear that he meant it, and had said it many times, and still meant it every time. It was fever. Fast. That's the only mercy of it. "Were you near a town?" "We were on the ranch," he said. There wasn't time to get to a doctor. By the time I got her to Cheyenne, it was done." He was looking out the window. His voice was even. "Her name was May." Diana held that name for a moment. May. The kind of name that felt like a small, complete thing. "She'd have liked Nevada," Caleb said. "She was a woman who liked big sky." He turned and looked at Diana, and there was the faintest trace of something like a careful smile at the corner of his mouth. Not forced, not performed, just present. Said Wyoming was good, but there wasn't enough of it. Diana almost laughed. It surprised her, that almost laugh the way a window surprises you, by letting in light you'd forgotten existed. "Nevada has enough sky," she said. "So I've found," he said. The car had grown quieter as the afternoon surrendered to early evening. Several passengers had dozed off. The mother across the aisle had her eyes closed, her daughter's head tipped against her shoulder. Outside, the land had turned a deep amber that the window divided into rectangles, and Diana looked at those rectangles and thought about her mother's letter and her father's silence and the house in Rawhide that she had grown up in and had been trying all her life to be worthy of. She had thought going to St. Louis was being worthy of it. She had thought Preston Hallowell was being worthy of it. She had believed in the way a young woman can believe things that in retrospect seem almost painfully innocent. That doing the right thing in the right way with the right appearance would produce the right result. And that if it didn't, she simply hadn't done it correctly enough yet. Preston Hallowell had corrected that belief thoroughly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," Caleb said. "What do you do?" Diana said slowly, "When the people who are supposed to, when the people you were raised to trust, when they decide the story about you, matters more to them than the truth of what happened." She was not looking at him. She was watching the amber light on the land. Caleb was quiet for the moment. Not the silence of a man searching for the right platitude, but the silence of a man who takes questions seriously and respects the person who asked enough to answer honestly. "Well," he said, "I reckon you let them keep their story." Diana looked at him. "You let them keep it," he said again, "because you can't take it from them, and fighting over it just costs you things you need for other purposes. And then you go ahead and live in a way that makes the story irrelevant." He paused. "That's easier said than done. Takes time. But it's the only thing I've ever seen actually work." "What if you don't have time?" Diana said. "What if you have to walk back into a town where they've already made up their minds?" Caleb turned and looked at her directly. "You talking about Rawhide?" "I'm talking about Rawhide," she said. He nodded slowly. He didn't say it'll be fine, or they'll understand, or things have a way of working out, all of which would have made her feel worse, because they would have been untrue, and they both would have known it. "Rawhide's a small town," he said, "and small towns got long memories. I won't lie to you about that." "No," Diana said quietly. "Please don't." "But small towns also got short attention spans," Caleb said. "What's a scandal one season is old news by the next, long as you give them something worth watching instead. You show up, and you work, and you don't hide, and you don't apologize for something that wasn't your fault. And after a while most people move on, because there's always something new to talk about." He leaned back slightly. "The ones that don't move on those aren't people whose opinion was ever worth much to begin with." Diana looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about her mother's letter. "I don't understand what you did to cause this, Diana." "My mother thinks it was my fault," she said. "She wrote and told me so." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, does she know what happened? She knows what Preston Halliwell's family told people happened, Diana said. She has not asked me directly for my account. The flatness in her own voice surprised her. 3 days ago, saying that had made her cry. Now it just made her tired. She's afraid, Caleb said. Not as a defense of Diana's mother, just as an observation. When people do something like that, when they accept someone else's version without asking, usually it's because they're afraid of what the truth might mean, afraid it changes things they thought were settled. Diana looked at him. That's a charitable interpretation. Maybe, Caleb said. Doesn't mean it's wrong. He looked out the window. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt like hell either. Diana breathed out through her nose. Outside, the last of the amber was fading into the deep blue that precedes dark, and the first lamps inside the car had been lit, and somewhere behind them, a child was asking a question in the patient, persistent way of children who have not yet learned that most questions don't get answered. She thought about what Caleb Xavier had said. Let them keep their story. Go ahead and live. Give them something worth watching instead. It was not the comfort of someone telling her everything would be all right. It was something sturdier than that, a blueprint, plain and practical, built on the assumption that she was capable of doing the work. That she was, in fact, the kind of person who could do it. Nobody had assumed that about her in a long time, not since before St. Louis. Maybe not since before the engagement, when she had still been Diana Thornton of Rawhide, Nevada, who kept her father's accounts and knew more about land deed law than the county clerk, and could ride better than any of her brothers. And none of that had seemed like something to be proud of, because none of it had been the kind of accomplishment people put in letters. My father, she said, hasn't written. Sometimes silence is just a man not knowing what to say yet, Caleb said. My father is not a man who suffers from not knowing what to say, Diana said dryly. He says exactly what he means always. His silence means he's disappointed. Or scared, Caleb said. Men who always say what they mean have to go quiet when they're scared, because they know they'll say the wrong thing otherwise. Diana looked at him for a long beat. You speak from experience. More than I'd like, Caleb said, and there was enough wry self-awareness in it that she almost smiled again. Almost. The train rattled on through the darkening plains. Diana pressed her shoulder blades against the back of the seat and let herself just fractionally release something she had been holding. Not the grief that was still there, dense and complicated, and it would be there for a long time. Not the anger that too had settled in for a long residence, but the particular grinding labor of being alone with it. That she could set down for now, in the presence of a man who was asking nothing from her but honesty, and giving the same in return. She did not know Caleb Xavier. She had known him for less than an afternoon. But there was a quality to his attention, unhurried, undemanding, oriented entirely toward the truth, that reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten existed. The world was not entirely made of people like Preston Halliwell. She had known that once. She had forgotten it in St. Louis in the parlors, and the gloved smiles, and the careful architecture of reputation management. She had forgotten it in the 3 days of silence and judgment on the eastbound train. She was beginning slowly, and without fanfare, to remember it now. Outside the window, the plains ran dark and wide, and full of stars that had no opinion about Diana Thornton's past, and the train carried her westward. And beside her, Caleb Xavier sat with the uncomplicated steadiness of a man who had nothing to prove, and nowhere more important to be. And Diana Thornton looked at the stars, and breathed, and thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, she was still here. She was still here, and the night was long, and she was not alone in it. Not tonight. The stars were still thick outside when the train slowed. Diana felt it before she fully understood it. The subtle change in rhythm beneath the wheels. The way the car tilted forward, almost imperceptibly, the squeal of iron that meant brakes being applied somewhere ahead. She had been half asleep, not quite under, but not quite awake either, in that loose gray space between the two, where the mind gives up its tight grip on things for a little while. She came alert all at once, the way a person does when they've spent days waiting for the next bad thing. Caleb was already sitting straight. "What is it?" Diana said. "Don't know yet," he said. He was looking toward the front of the car. The other passengers were stirring a murmur, moving through the seats the way murmurs always do, a low collective unease that hadn't yet decided what shape it wanted to take. The conductor came through the door at a pace that was measured, deliberate, the walk of a man who does not want to cause panic and is choosing each step with that goal in mind. He was a compact man in his 50s, with a gray mustache that he touched when he was thinking, and he was touching it now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice just enough to reach the back of the car. "We're going to be stopping in Elko for the night. There's a section of track ahead that's been reported washed out. We'll resume in the morning once we have confirmation it's been repaired or rerouted." The murmur shifted into something more distinct. Complaints from a man near the front, a woman's sharp exhale, the tired resignation of the child in the back who had run out of questions. Diana heard it all from what felt like a slight distance. "How long?" A man called out. "Morning at the earliest," the conductor said. "The station in Elko has accommodations and there are several hotels in town. The railroad will do what it can to assist, but I won't promise more than I can deliver." He touched his mustache again. "We apologize for the inconvenience." Diana did not move immediately. She sat and felt the train slow around her, heard Elko announced again at a lower volume as the conductor made his way back through, and she thought with the calm that sometimes comes when you've already been through the worst of something and everything after. It feels almost abstract by comparison. "I have $11.40. She had counted it on the platform in St. Louis. She had her return ticket already purchased through to Rawhide, and she had the $11.40, which was what she had left after 3 days in a rented room and 2 train station meals that she'd barely touched, and a telegraph she'd sent to her mother that her mother had not responded to. $11.40 was not nothing. But it was not a hotel night in an unfamiliar town with food, and still having enough left to manage the unexpected. And Diana Thornton was very good at arithmetic. She was still sitting with that calculation arranged neatly and unhelpfully in her mind, when Caleb stood and reached for his saddlebag, and said without looking at her, "You have somewhere to stay in Elko." "I'll manage," Diana said. He looked at her then. She had noticed over the course of the afternoon and evening, a way of looking at a person that communicated clearly that he was not fooled without making a production of it. It was not unkind. It was simply honest. The way a plumb line is honest, it doesn't argue with you. It just shows you where the true vertical is. "There's a hotel owned by a man named Prentice Holt," Caleb said. "He's a decent man. I've stayed there before. It's clean and it's reasonable, and Prentice won't ask you a lot of questions you don't want to answer." "I said I'll manage," Diana said. "I know what you said," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was not pressing. He was not performing charity or wearing the particular expression of a man who expects to be thanked. He was simply standing there with his saddlebag and his worn canvas coat and his dark level eyes offering a fact. There was a hotel, it was decent, and he knew the man who ran it. "I'm not taking your money," Diana said. "Didn't offer it," Caleb said. "I offered an introduction. What you do with that's your own business." Diana stood. Her back ached from the hours of rigid sitting, and she straightened slowly, gathering her composure, the way she gathered her coat one arm and then the other methodically, because methodical was the only speed she had left. She looked at the other passengers collecting their things, the small chaos of an unplanned stop, and she thought about $11.40, and her mother's letter and her father's silence, and the particular indignity of being a woman who prided herself on managing her own affairs, and currently could not manage a train delay without assistance. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Caleb nodded once and moved toward the door. Elko at night was cold and wide awake, in the way that railroad towns tend to be built for transit accustomed to strangers pragmatic about both. The station platform was lit by lanterns and the glow from the station house windows, and the passengers from the train moved through it in their various directions with the distracted energy of people whose plans had been rearranged by events outside their control. Diana walked beside Caleb at a pace that she set, and he matched without comment, which she appreciated without knowing quite how to say so. Prentice Holt's hotel was 3 blocks from the station on a street that was quiet enough to feel like a different town, than the one immediately surrounding the rails. The building was 2 stories solid, with lamps burning on either side of the front door, and window boxes that had been planted with something she couldn't tell what in the dark, that gave the entrance an air of stubborn domesticity that Diana found unexpectedly moving. Caleb pushed through the door first and held it. The man behind the front desk was wide across the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the face of a man who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. He looked up when they came in, and his face did what faces do when they recognize someone, a shift, a softening, a brief recalibration. "Caleb Xavier," the man said. "Didn't expect you through here this time of year." "Washed out track," Caleb said. "Stranded for the night." He gestured without fanfare. "This is Diana Thornton from Rawhide. She needs a room." Prentice Holt looked at Diana in the direct but entirely non-aggressive way of a man who has run a hotel long enough to have learned the difference between a look that assesses and a look that judges. "Miss Thornton," he said, "we've got 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. 12 cents for the night includes breakfast. 12 cents. Diana had 12 cents and considerably more, but the relief of hearing the number was physical something she felt in her shoulders. "That's fine," she said. "Thank you." "Sign the book," Prentice said, turning it toward her, "and I'll have the girl bring up some hot water." He glanced at Caleb. "You want your usual—" "Same as always," Caleb said. While Diana signed Prentice and Caleb exchanged a few words about the track situation, about the state of the road north of Elko, about a mutual acquaintance whose name Diana didn't catch. It was the conversation of 2 men who have no agenda with each other and no need to perform, and Diana listened to it while she signed her name, and thought about how rare that was, that particular quality of ease between people who trust each other, because they've earned it, rather than because they're required to. Prentice's daughter, a girl of perhaps 15, with her father's broad shoulders and a no-nonsense efficiency that suggested she'd been working in this hotel since she was old enough to carry a pitcher, appeared with hot water and a clean towel, and showed Diana to her room with the brisk friendliness of someone who understood that travelers were tired and did not need to be entertained. The room was small. The bed was clean. There was a window that looked onto the dark street below, where the lamplight made rectangles on the dirt. Diana set her bag down and poured water into the basin, and washed her face and hands, and in the mirror above the basin, she looked at herself directly, something she had been avoiding for the first time since St. Louis. She looked tired. She looked older than she'd felt when she got on the train in St. Louis, older than she'd felt when she'd set Preston Hallowell's ring on the mantelpiece and walked out of his house into the cold. She also looked, she thought, like herself. Still herself. That was something. After 3 days of feeling like she'd been erased and redrawn by other people's hands, the face in the mirror was still recognizably her own. She was still looking at it when there was a knock at the door. She dried her hands and opened it. Prentice's daughter was there with a tray bread and butter and a bowl of soup that sent up a thin curl of steam. "Pa said you looked like you hadn't eaten," the girl said with the directness of the young. "The bread's from this morning, but it's still good." Diana looked at the tray and then at the girl and thought she might for the second time that day be embarrassed by the kindness of strangers. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" "Louisa," the girl said. "You want anything else? Just holler down the stairs. I'm up late most nights anyway." She said it matter-of-factly like a professional and left. Diana ate the soup. She ate most of the bread. She sat on the edge of the clean bed in Prentice Holt's hotel in Elko, Nevada, and she ate food that had been brought to her without conditions by a girl named Louisa, who had her father's broad shoulders, and she let herself very quietly and entirely without witnesses feel something other than shame for the first time in 3 days. She was not sure what to call it. Not happiness, not relief exactly, something smaller than those and possibly more durable. The simple physical fact of being in a clean room with food in her stomach and nothing immediately terrible happening. The day had been what it had been, the women across the aisle, the cold geometry of her finances, the strange and unlooked-for steadiness of a cowboy from Wyoming, who had sat beside her because every other seat was taken. But she was still here. She was still here, and the room was quiet, and tomorrow the track would be repaired, and she would get back on the train and get to Rawhide and deal with whatever Rawhide had waiting for her. She had dealt with worse. She was beginning to believe that again. In the morning, the dining room smelled like coffee and salt pork and the particular optimism of early hours that are not yet complicated by everything a day can accumulate. Diana came down to find 3 other stranded passengers from the train already at the long table, and Caleb at the end of it, with a cup of coffee and a plate that was mostly finished, talking with Prentice about something she couldn't hear from the doorway. He looked up when she came in. He didn't say good morning in the way that people say it when they want acknowledgement of the greeting. He just nodded and pulled out the chair beside him, and she sat down. Prentice's wife, a small, quick woman named Ruth with flour on her apron, and an expression of sustained competence, brought coffee and a plate, without being asked the way women who run good households understand what a person needs before the person has processed it themselves. "Track's being assessed now," Caleb said. "Word from the station is, we'll know by 9. "And if it's not repaired by 9, Diana said. "Then it gets repaired by noon," he said simply. "Either way, we're moving today." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Across the table, a man in a business suit was reading a folded paper with the focused urgency of someone who needs to feel he is managing a situation. Beside him, a woman his wife Diana guessed from the practiced patience with which she ignored him, was cutting a piece of bread into precise squares. Life, Diana thought. People just doing the ordinary fractured continuing work of being alive. "I want to ask you something," Diana said. Caleb looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Ask." "Last night you said let them keep their story and go live in a way that makes it irrelevant." She set her cup down. "Did that actually work for you after May? After Wyoming?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. He set his own cup down and looked at it, and when he looked up, his expression was the same as it always was. Honest, unhurried. But there was something additional in it now. The particular weight of a question that has been lived rather than just considered. "No," he said. "Not at first." "What happened at first?" "At first," Caleb said, "I made every mistake a grieving man can make. I picked fights I didn't need to pick. I drank more than I should. I left Wyoming fast because I couldn't stand to be in the place where she'd been, and then I got to Nevada, and I didn't know anybody, and I thought that would help, and it made it worse." He paused. "Isolation isn't peace. I found that out the hard way." "What changed?" He was quiet again, thinking. "I bought the land," he said. "That was the first thing. I had some money I'd been saving May, and I had been saving it together. We had a plan for a place of our own, and I went and I found a piece of ground in Nevada, and I bought it. And I started building." His voice had settled into something steadier. "Not because I believed it would fix anything. I didn't. I needed something to do with my hands. Something that would be there tomorrow and the day after and be better, because I'd worked on it." He looked at her. "And it didn't fix anything. May was still gone. But I was still there, and the work was still there. And after a while I realized that the story I'd been telling myself, that I couldn't survive it, that the person I'd been with her was gone too, that story stopped being true. I was still here, still someone." Diana looked at him steadily. "You're not going to tell me it was easy," she said. "No, ma'am," Caleb said. "It was the hardest thing I have ever done. It took longer than I wanted and cost more than I thought I had to spend." He picked up his coffee cup again. "But you asked if it worked, and it did, eventually." Diana thought about her father's ranch outside Rawhide. She thought about the account book she'd kept since she was 14, the columns she'd organized, and the discrepancies she'd caught, and the month she'd found an error in the land deed registry that had saved her father $300 and a court dispute. She thought about the work of it, the plain, demanding, legible work of numbers that didn't lie and records that didn't change their story, depending on who was listening. She had left all of that to go to St. Louis and become the right kind of woman for a man who had not deserved the effort. "My father's ranch needs work," she said, and she was not sure she'd intended to say it out loud until it was already said. Caleb looked at her. "The accounts were in poor shape when I left," she said. "I'd been the one keeping them, and I left in a hurry, and I don't know what state they're in now. My father never had much patience for the paperwork side of things." She paused. "There's a land dispute, too, with the property on the eastern boundary. I'd been researching the original deed records before I went to St. Louis. I hadn't finished." "Sounds like you have things to go back to," Caleb said. "I had things to go back to before," Diana said. "I just didn't understand their value." He looked at her for a moment, not with the kind of look that meant he was waiting for her to finish a thought, with the kind of look that meant she had said something worth sitting with, and he was sitting with it. "You know," he said, "most people who get knocked down the way you've been knocked down, they spend the whole ride home trying to figure out how to explain themselves, how to make other people understand, how to control the story." He turned his cup slowly on the table. "You're already thinking about what you're going to build." Diana considered that. She thought about whether it was true, and decided it was, and felt something shift in how she held it, like a piece of furniture moved 2 feet to the left, showing you a different view of the same room. "I'm still angry," she said. "Good," Caleb said. "Anger's useful if you aim it right. And I'm still afraid," she said, because it felt important to be honest about that now in this dining room in Elko, with the coffee going warm in her hands. "Of walking back in. Of what my mother will say. Of what the town will have decided." "Yes," Caleb said. "That's reasonable." "You're not going to tell me not to be afraid." "I'm not going to tell you anything that isn't true," he said. "Being afraid is true. Rawhide having opinions is true. Your mother having said what she said is true." He met her eyes. "You being capable of handling all of that is also true, whether you believe it yet or not." Diana looked at him across the table in Prentice Holt's dining room, in the ordinary morning light, with the coffee and the salt pork, and the sound of the other passengers beginning to stir toward the day. She looked at this man she had met less than 24 hours ago. This man from Wyoming, who had lost his wife, and bought land, and built something out of the particular unspectacular work of surviving, and she thought that there were certain people you met in this life whose presence clarified something in you. Not because they told you things you didn't know, but because they said back to you plainly the things you already knew and had stopped trusting. She was capable. She had always been capable. She had known that about herself since she was 14 years old, with a set of account books and a sharper eye for numbers than anyone twice her age. That knowledge had not gone anywhere. Preston Hallowell had not taken it. His family's story had not taken it. Her mother's letter had not taken it. It was still there, exactly where she'd left it, waiting for her to come back and pick it up. She straightened in her chair. She finished her coffee. Outside down the street toward the station, someone was calling out that the engineer was ready and the track had been cleared. The train was leaving at 9 after all. They boarded the train at 8:55, and Diana chose the same seat without thinking about it, which told her something about how much had shifted in the span of a single night. Yesterday she had chosen that seat to hide. Today she chose it because it was hers. Caleb settled in beside her with the same unhurried ease as before, set his saddlebag down, and said nothing. And the saying nothing felt like the right thing in the right amount, which was becoming characteristic of him, in a way Diana was still learning how to account for. The train pulled out of Elko, and the land opened up again, wide and pale, and indifferent in the way she had always loved, and Diana turned her face toward the window and let herself look at it properly this time. Not hiding behind it, just looking. They had perhaps 4 hours left to Carson City, and from Carson City, her connection to Rawhide was another 2. She had done this math already multiple times in the way the mind returns to things it's not ready to stop worrying about. 6 hours, give or take. 6 hours until she stepped onto the platform in Rawhide, and whatever was waiting for her there became real. She was thinking about that not anxiously, exactly, more the way you think about a fence. You know you'll have to climb. You're not dreading it yet, just measuring it when Caleb said, "You keep your father's accounts, you said." "I did," Diana said, "before St. Louis." "You always have a head for numbers, or did you learn it?" It was a genuine question, asked with the particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize in him as his natural mode, interested without being intrusive, direct without being demanding. She considered it the way it deserved. "Both," she said. "My grandmother taught me the basics. When I was young, she was a sharp woman, sharper than most people gave her credit for, which was common enough then and still is now. She said a woman who can't read a balance sheet is a woman who'll always need permission to understand her own life. Diana paused. I didn't entirely know what she meant at 11. I understand it considerably better now. Smart woman, Caleb said. The smartest I've known, Diana said. She died when I was 16. Left me her ledger books and her reading glasses and a note that said, "Don't let anyone tell you numbers are beyond you." She looked at the window. I've never forgotten that note. And the legal side of it, Caleb said. You mentioned deed records, land disputes. That came later, Diana said. Our eastern neighbor man named Gideon Pratt, he's been pushing at our property line for 6 years. Small things mostly the way certain men do when they're testing how much they can take before someone pushes back. A fence moved here, a survey marker shifted there. My father dealt with it the way my father deals with most things, directly, loudly, and without documentation. She said the last word with an emphasis that carried a considerable amount of history. I started looking at the original land grant records 2 years ago because I was tired of the same argument repeating with no resolution. I found some irregularities. Caleb's attention sharpened. She could feel it without looking at him. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggested Pratt's deed was recorded against a survey that had been altered after the fact, Diana said. I don't mean lost or ambiguous, I mean altered. The original survey in the county records shows a boundary line approximately 40 yards east of where Pratt's deed places it, which would put a significant portion of what he claims as his land well within my father's original grant. That's not a small thing, Caleb said. No, Diana said. It's not. I had gotten as far as requesting copies of 3 different versions of the county survey, the original, the one attached to Pratt's deed, and an intermediate one filed in 1871 that nobody seemed to have looked at very closely. I was in the middle of comparing them when... She stopped. When Preston Hallowell sent a letter, Caleb said. When Preston Hallowell sent a letter, she confirmed. And I packed my trunk and went to St. Louis and left the surveys in a box under my bed and spent 6 months learning to pour tea correctly. She said it without self-pity, but the flatness of it landed in the space between them with weight. Caleb was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man who doesn't know what to say, but the silence of one who knows that some things deserve to be acknowledged before you move past them. Those surveys still in that box, he said. Unless my father threw them out, Diana said. Which he wouldn't. He doesn't throw out paper. It's one of his better qualities. Then you've got work to do when you get back, Caleb said. I've got work to do, Diana agreed, and the phrase settled into her chest differently than she'd expected, not like a burden settling in, but like something finding its proper place. Yes. Work. The specific, legible, honest work of records and numbers that didn't bend themselves to accommodate what people wanted to be true. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. And Gideon Pratt had been taking things from her father for 6 years, and she had been 40 yards from proving it when she'd let herself be distracted by the idea of a life that was supposed to be better than the one she had. The life she had, it turned out, was already worth more than she'd known. They were somewhere east of Winnemucca when the trouble arrived. It came in the form of a man Diana had not noticed earlier, whether because he'd been in a different car or because she'd been too wrapped in her own head to register him, she couldn't say. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed in the specific way of men who want you to know they can afford to be well-dressed, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something harder and more deliberate. He came down the aisle from the front of the car, and he stopped beside their row, and when Diana looked up and saw his face, she knew immediately, with the particular clarity that comes of having recently survived exactly this, that he was not stopping to ask about the seat. He was looking at her with recognition, with something behind the recognition that made her stomach drop. "Miss Thornton," he said. He said it in the tone people use when they're announcing something to a room, rather than addressing a person, pitched just enough above conversation level that the passengers nearest them would hear it without question. Diana held his gaze. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "We haven't," the man said. "But I know who you are. My cousin is married to Daniel Hallowell Preston's brother. You've caused a considerable amount of distress to that family." He paused, letting the word family do the work he intended it to do, invoking the gravity of institution of kinship, of collective judgment. "I thought I recognized you from the platform in St. Louis. I wanted to be sure." The car had gone quiet in the particular way that cars go quiet when something is happening that isn't ordinary travel. Diana felt the eyes on her. She felt them the same way she'd felt the women's glances on the first day, except this time it was not furtive. It was open because this man had made it open, had made the moment into a small public reckoning, which was exactly what he'd intended. She said very evenly, "I'm sorry to hear Mr. Hallowell's family has been distressed. I've been distressed myself. I suspect we have rather different accounts of why." The man smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "I've heard your account," he said. "Or rather, I've heard what you've been telling people. I think most reasonable parties would find Preston's version considerably more credible." "Most reasonable parties," Diana said, "weren't in that parlor." "No," the man said. "They weren't, which means they're left to judge by character. And character." He tilted his head. A small surgical movement is something that speaks for itself over time. He was good at it, Diana thought. He was practiced at exactly this, the insinuation that never quite became an accusation, the implication that could always be walked back as misinterpretation, the public performance of polite concern that was really an execution. Preston had been good at it too. It was apparently a skill the Hallowell family cultivated. She was forming her reply, measured, controlled, the kind of response that did not give him more material to work with when Caleb stood up. He didn't do it quickly or dramatically. He simply stood the way a man stands when he's decided something with the complete, unhurried authority of someone who is not performing anything and doesn't need to. He was considerably taller than the man from the Hallowell family, and he did not step forward aggressively, did not raise his voice, did not do anything that could be described as threatening. He simply stood there and looked at the man and said, "That's enough." The man from the Hallowell family looked at Caleb with an expression that moved through several stages. Surprise assessment, the rapid recalculation of a man who has been unexpectedly confronted with a variable he hadn't included in his planning. "I beg your pardon," the man said, shifting to the tone of affronted dignity. "This is a private conversation." "No," Caleb said. "It isn't. You made sure it wasn't when you decided to have it in a train car full of people." His voice was the same quiet it always was, the same measured, unhurried tone that somehow managed to carry without effort. "You made it public. I'm responding in kind." "I don't know who you are," the man said. "I know," Caleb said. "That's not going to change what I'm telling you." The man straightened. He was doing the calculation, the social calculation, the one about what this looked like to the watching passengers, about whether escalation served him or cost him. Diana could see it happening behind his eyes. Men like this were always calculating. It was what they did, instead of simply being honest. "Miss Thornton has been the subject of a serious scandal," the man said, pivoting slightly, redirecting toward the audience he'd originally been playing to. "The people in her community deserve to know. The people in her community," Caleb said, "aren't on this train. You're on this train. And you came down this aisle because you saw a woman alone, and you thought that meant she was without anyone to stand for her." He paused. "She's not alone." Something in the man's expression shifted. Not embarrassment. Men like that rarely accessed genuine embarrassment, but the flat recognition of a gambit that had failed. He had come down the aisle expecting an undefended target. He had found something different. "I see," the man said, and the tone had cooled into something clipped and careful. He looked at Diana. "I hope your journey is comfortable, Miss Thornton." He said it the way you say things that mean their opposite, and he went back up the aisle toward the front of the car. The car's attention followed him for a few seconds, and then redistributed itself in the particular way of people pretending they hadn't been watching. Someone coughed. A child at the back resumed a conversation that had been suspended. Caleb sat back down. Diana had not moved through any of it. She had kept her spine straight, and her hands still, and her face composed. And she had watched Caleb Xavier stand up for her in a train car in the middle of the Nevada desert, with the same clean economy of motion he brought to everything. And she felt something moving behind her sternum that was too large and too complicated to name right now, so she did not try. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what Caleb said." "Stepping in," Diana said. "Yesterday with the women across the aisle. Now him." "Yesterday was different," Caleb said. "Yesterday was a woman talking loud enough to be overheard. Today was a man who came down here to make a scene." He set his saddlebag straight on the floor. "That's not something I can sit still through." "You could have," Diana said. "Most people would have." "Most people," Caleb said, "aren't sitting next to you." It was a plain sentence, simply delivered, and it landed with an exactness that made Diana have to look away for a moment out the window at the passing land while she managed what it had done to her chest. "He'll say things when he gets where he's going," she said. "About me. About you, probably. About this." "Let him," Caleb said. He was going to say things regardless. Men like that don't need a reason. "He'll say we're—" Diana stopped. "He'll say whatever makes the story most interesting to him," Caleb said. "And people who know either one of us won't believe it, and people who don't know us were going to think whatever they were going to think anyway." He looked at her. "Does it change anything that matters?" Diana thought about it honestly. She thought about Rawhide and her father's silence, and her mother's letter, and the survey documents in the box under her bed, and the 40 yards of land that Gideon Pratt had been helping himself to for 6 years. She thought about what Caleb had said that morning. "You're already thinking about what you're going to build." "No," she said. "It doesn't change anything that matters." "Then we don't have to talk about him anymore," Caleb said, and turned back toward the window, and that was that. But the encounter had done something Diana realized that she hadn't expected it to do. It had clarified something. The man from the Halliwell family had come down that aisle because he looked at Diana Thornton and saw a woman in retreat, a woman running from something head down, absorbed in her own shame, available to be made an example of. That was what she had been when she got on this train in St. Louis. That was the shape she'd been wearing. And she understood now, with the kind of understanding that comes from seeing something from the outside, how much that shape had cost her. How much it had invited exactly the kind of treatment she'd been receiving, not because she deserved it, but because shame, when it's worn plainly, tends to attract the people who feed on it. She was done wearing it. Not because the situation wasn't painful, it was still a bruise that ran deeper than she could fully probe, but because wearing it wasn't helping anything, and it wasn't true. She had not done anything that warranted shame. She had trusted a man who did not deserve trust, and she had ended the situation when she discovered the truth. And both of those things were just things that happened to people living their lives honestly in an imperfect world. There was nothing in that to be ashamed of. Preston Halliwell should be ashamed. The man from the Halliwell family who had come down the aisle to make a spectacle of her should be ashamed. Her mother, who had accepted a stranger's version of events without asking her own daughter, should be sitting with some considerable discomfort about that. Diana Thornton was going to go home and open that box under her bed and finish what she'd started with the survey records, and she was going to do it with her back straight and her name intact because her name was hers and she had not surrendered it. She turned from the window. She looked at Caleb Xavier, who was looking at the passing land with the easy patience of a man who trusts the distance to diminish on its own time. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. He turned and looked at her, and something in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a small, careful opening, shifted. "What do you want to know?" he said. "All of it," Diana said. "How you chose the land, how you built it, what it looks like in the morning." She paused. "What you're still working on." He looked at her for a moment, in the way she'd come to understand meant he was deciding whether she meant it, and then decided she did. "All right," Caleb said, and he turned in his seat and began to talk, and Diana listened, and the train moved west through the Nevada morning, and neither of them noticed when Carson City began to appear on the edges of the land ahead, because they were not finished talking, and the distance was diminishing exactly as it should at its own pace, And there was still time. Carson City arrived the way all destinations arrive when you've stopped watching for them suddenly without ceremony. The land simply changing its character around the train until buildings appeared, and the pace slowed, and the conductor was moving through the car calling out the station name, with the neutral professionalism of a man who has said it several thousand times. Diana had been listening to Caleb talk about the ranch for the better part of an hour. He talked about it the way people talk about things they have built with their own hands, not with boasting, but with the specific quiet pride of someone describing something real. The north pasture that flooded every spring and what he'd done about it. The problem with the second well, and how Ruiz had solved it in a way Caleb hadn't thought of, which he recounted with genuine admiration rather than any trace of wounded pride. The barn they'd raised in the fall with 3 neighboring families who'd shown up without being asked, which he described simply as the way people do things out here without sentimentality, though Diana could hear in the telling how much it had meant to him. She had asked questions, real ones, not the polite social kind designed to indicate interest while waiting for your turn to speak. She'd asked about his water rights and the terms of his land grant, and whether he'd had trouble with the county assessor's office, and Caleb had answered each one directly, and then looked at her sidelong and said, "You know a considerable amount about land management for a woman who's been keeping accounts." "The accounts are part of the land management," Diana said. "You can't separate them. A ranch that runs well on the ground but poorly on paper doesn't run well for long." "That's true," Caleb said. "I've seen it happen to good men. My father nearly let it happen to him," Diana said. 3 years ago, a drought year. He was managing the herd well better than anyone in the county, but the books were a disaster. He didn't know what he owed or what he was owed or where the margin was. I spent a month sorting it out." She paused. "He didn't thank me for it directly. He bought me a new saddle the following spring and didn't explain why. With my father, that counts." Caleb almost smiled. "Sounds like a man I'd understand." "Most men understand him," Diana said. "Women who've lived with him understand him and find it exhausting in equal measure." He did smile, then a real one, brief and unguarded, and Diana filed it away without examining it too closely, because there were things you could look at directly, and things that required a certain oblique attention, and she was beginning to understand which category Caleb Xavier belonged to. Now the train was slowing into Carson City, and Caleb was standing gathering his saddlebag, and Diana stood too, and the ordinary logistics of arrival organized themselves around the larger, less ordinary fact that this was where they parted. She had known it was coming. She had known it since Elko, since this morning in Prentice Holt's dining room, since the moment on the train yesterday, when Caleb had said Carson City and she had said Rawhide, and the distance between those 2 words had been clear. She had known it, and she had not dwelt on it, because dwelling on it would have taken her attention from the present, and the present had turned out to be worth paying attention to. But here it was. The platform at Carson City was busier than Elko, the particular organized chaos of a city that considers itself the center of something which Carson City did because it was. Caleb moved through the crowd with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything, and Diana walked beside him because her connecting train to Rawhide didn't leave for another hour and 20 minutes, and the station was where she needed to be regardless. They found a relatively quiet spot near the far end of the platform, where the crowd thinned out, and the noise dropped enough to speak without raising your voice. Caleb set his saddlebag down. He looked at her. "Your connection's at," he started. 2:45, Diana said. "I checked before we left Elko." "Platform 3, he said. "Other end of the station through the main hall. You'll want to allow more time than you think you need. It gets crowded in the main hall after 2. "Thank you," she said. There was a pause. Not an uncomfortable one. Nothing with Caleb Xavier was uncomfortable in the way that silences usually were, but a weighted one, full of the acknowledgement that something was ending, something that had been brief by any measurable standard, and yet had the particular density of things that matter. "I want to say something," Diana said. "Then say it," Caleb said. She looked at him directly the way she'd been learning to look at things directly again. "When I got on that train in St. Louis, I was—" She stopped. Started again. "I had decided I think that the world had finished with me. Not consciously. I didn't sit down and make that decision. But it was operating somewhere underneath everything else. The idea that what had happened had defined something permanent. That what Preston Halliwell and his family had said about me was now just what was true. What would always be true. She kept her eyes on his. You didn't argue with that. You didn't tell me I was wrong to feel it, or that I needed to think differently. You just treated me like a person who was going somewhere, like the destination was still real. Caleb said nothing. He was listening. I don't know if you know how rare that is, Diana said. What you did on that train, what you did in Elko, what you did this morning when that man came down the aisle. She took a breath. I'm going to go back to Rawhide, and I'm going to open that box under my bed, and I'm going to finish what I started with those surveys. And I'm going to do it because of something you reminded me I already knew. She paused. So, thank you, for all of it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the level, honest attention that she had stopped finding unnerving somewhere around Winnemucca, and had started finding she would not examine the word too closely steadying. You would have gotten there on your own, he said. Maybe, Diana said. Eventually, but it would have taken longer and cost more. Something moved through his expression, that careful, unguarded thing she'd seen once before, brief as a door opening and closing. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. You find something with those surveys, he said. You're going to need someone to present it in a way the county clerk takes seriously. A woman walking in alone with documents, even solid ones, that's a harder road than it should be. I know, Diana said. Your father's going to believe you, Caleb said. Once he's past whatever he's sitting with right now. Once you walk in and he sees you're the same woman he's always known. He paused. But if you need someone who's done business in this county, who knows the land recorder's office, and a few men who matter in the legal proceedings around deed disputes, you can write to me. Diana looked at him. Carson City. Care of the Carson City Post Office, he said. They know my name. Any letter addressed to Caleb Xavier will find me. That's a generous offer from a man who doesn't know me, Diana said. I know enough, Caleb said. She held his gaze for a moment and understood with the particular clarity of a woman who is good at assessing what things are actually worth that he meant it. Not as a social nicety. Not as the kind of offer people make in parting when they expect to never hear from you and wouldn't know what to do if they did. He meant it the way he'd meant everything else, plainly, with the intention of following through. All right, she said. I may take you up on that. I hope you do, Caleb said. And then, because there wasn't anything left to say, and both of them understood that he picked up his saddlebag, and she held out her hand, and he shook it. A real handshake, firm and honest. The kind that treats the other person as someone worth the gesture, and he touched his hat brim once more and walked off through the Carson City crowd. And Diana watched him go until the crowd absorbed him, and then she stopped watching and turned back toward the station. She had an hour and 20 minutes. She found a bench along the station wall, and she sat down, and she let the noise of the platform move around her without trying to manage it, which was something she couldn't have done 2 days ago. 2 days ago, she had been sitting in a train in St. Louis, with her hat pulled down over her face, and every sound in the world feeling like a personal accusation. Today, she sat on a platform bench in Carson City and listened to the noise of a busy public place and felt not fine. She was not fine. She was still carrying everything she'd been carrying when she got on this journey. But she was carrying it differently. More upright. With both hands instead of hunched around it. The hour passed. She bought a small meat pie from a vendor moving through the station, spent 12 cents on it, did not hesitate, and ate it on the bench, and watched the Carson City business of the world conduct itself around her, and she thought about her father. James Thornton was not a complicated man, which was itself a complicated thing to be, because people often mistook simplicity for simpleness, which it was not. Her father was direct, principled, occasionally infuriating, and possessed of the particular blind spot common to men of his generation. And geography, the belief that his women were to be protected from the world, which meant he found it genuinely difficult to accept that the world had gotten to Diana without his being able to stop it. His silence in the aftermath of St. Louis, was not Diana had come to believe over the course of this journey indifference. It was the silence of a man who didn't know how to speak to a failure he felt was his own. He would not say that. He would never say it in those words. But when she walked back into that house, and she would walk in directly through the front door because she was not sneaking into her own family home, she thought she understood now what she was walking into. Not a trial. A man who was scared and didn't know what scared looked like on his own face. She could work with that. Her mother was a more delicate problem. Eleanor Thornton was a woman who managed her world by managing information about it, by knowing what was said and who said it, and what the appropriate response was, and by staying oriented at all times toward whatever configuration of facts kept the family in the best possible light. She had written that letter. I don't understand what you did to cause this, because she needed Diana to have caused something, needed the situation to have a mechanism she could understand and correct, because a world in which Diana had done nothing wrong and been treated badly anyway was a world in which Eleanor Thornton could not protect her daughter by managing the circumstances. And that terrified her in a way she would never name. Diana had spent the train ride to St. Louis being angry at that letter. Then she had spent 3 days in St. Louis being devastated by it. Somewhere between Elko and Carson City, she had moved into something that was not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but was at least understanding. Her mother was afraid. Fear made people reach for the nearest available explanation. The nearest available explanation had been Diana's fault, because that was the version that gave Eleanor Thornton something to work with. Diana would correct it, carefully, directly, without cruelty, because her mother was not a cruel person, even if she had done a cruel thing. She would sit down with her mother, and she would tell her what actually happened. All of it start to finish, and she would watch her mother process it. And she would be patient with that processing, because it was going to be uncomfortable, and the discomfort was necessary. And then she was going to get that box out from under her bed. She boarded the 245 to Rawhide and found a window seat, and this time she did not pull her hat down over her face. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she watched the land change again as the train moved out of Carson City. Still big sky, still wide and pale, but with the particular qualities of the land she had grown up in, the specific color of the rock and the specific tilt of the light that her body recognized before her mind named it. She was almost home. The train was perhaps 40 minutes outside of Rawhide when the conductor came through, and a man 2 rows ahead stood and stretched and turned in the aisle, and Diana recognized him, Henry Alcott. 50-some years old, ran the general store in Rawhide with his wife. Bet had known Diana's family since before Diana was born, was the single most reliable vector of information in a town that ran almost entirely on information. He was the worst possible person to encounter on this train, and also Diana thought with a steadiness that surprised her completely manageable. Henry saw her at the same moment she recognized him. She watched his face do what faces do, the recognition, the quick involuntary recalibration, and then she was relieved to see something that was not hostile. Henry Alcott was a gossip, but not a cruel man. The distinction mattered. "Diana Thornton," he said. He said it without volume, not whispering, just speaking at a normal human level which she appreciated. "Mr. Alcott," she said. "How are Bet and the children?" He blinked, steadied himself. The question was so ordinary, so entirely the question that would have been asked before any of this, that it had the effect of returning them both to a baseline of normalcy that Diana suspected he was relieved to stand on. "They're well," he said. We've been well." He shifted. He was deciding what to say, and she could see him deciding it the way you can always see a not unkind person deciding how to navigate something they haven't navigated before. "I'm coming home," Diana said simply. No explanation, no apology, no preemptive defense. "Yes?" Henry said. "I can see that. I expect there's been talk," Diana said, because naming it directly was always better than circling it and pretending it wasn't there, and because she wanted Henry Alcott, who would inevitably be the vector for whatever version of this afternoon's encounter made its way through Rawhide, to hear her say it without blinking. "There's been some," Henry said with the small, honest discomfort of a man who has participated in that talk and is now standing in front of its subject. I imagine, Diana said, the Halliwell family is well connected in certain circles, and they have a version of events that serves them. I have a different version that happens to be true. She held his gaze. In time, the difference will be clear. I'm not worried about it. Henry Alcott looked at her for a long moment. He had known her since she was a child. He had seen her keep her father's accounts at 14 and argue land boundaries with the county clerk at 19 and ride better than her brothers at any age. He had, Diana suspected, always known exactly what Diana Thornton was made of, even when Diana herself had briefly forgotten. Your daddy'll be glad to see you, Henry said. I hope so, Diana said. Henry nodded once, the nod of a man who has taken something in and will think about it later, and went back to his seat. Diana turned back to the window. The land was shifting under a late afternoon sky that had gone to the particular deep gold of Nevada in the waning daylight hours, and she could feel in the way you feel things before you see them that Rawhide was close now. She could feel it in her bones, the specific recognition of a place where your body knows every temperature and smell and quality of light, even when your mind is occupied with other things. She reached up and removed her hat. She smoothed her hair back. She sat the way she intended to arrive present, upright, undefended, exactly herself. The station at Rawhide was small and plain and entirely familiar. And when the train pulled in and the conductor called the name Diana, stood up from her seat with her bag, and she walked to the door, and she stepped out onto the platform, and she stood in the last of the afternoon light, and she breathed the air of the place where she'd been born. And there at the far end of the platform, standing with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, in the way he always turned it when he didn't know what to do with himself, was her father. James Thornton was a tall man, going gray at the temples, with the weathered, angular face of someone who had spent 40 years under this particular sky. He was not smiling. He was not frowning. He was just standing there with his hat in his hands, and when he saw Diana come through the crowd, he went very still. Diana walked toward him. She did not hurry. She did not stop. When she was close enough, he said in a voice that was rougher than his usual voice, lower, with something worked into it that he had clearly been carrying for some time. Diana. Papa, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Her face, her posture, the way she was standing reading all of it. The way a man reads something he's been worried was damaged and is trying to assess what's still sound. Then James Thornton put his arms around his daughter and held on the way. A man holds on when he's been scared, and the thing he was scared of losing is back in his hands, and Diana pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed out and felt the first solid ground beneath her feet since St. Louis. I'm here, she said. I know, he said. I know you are. They stood like that for a moment on the Rawhide platform, while the crowd moved around them, and the train prepared to continue, and the Nevada sky went deeper gold, and then James Thornton stepped back and looked at his daughter with eyes that were not dry. Your mother's at home, he said. I know, Diana said. She's... He stopped, started again. She knows she was wrong, he said. In that letter, she knows. She hasn't, she doesn't know how to... I'll talk to her, Diana said. Her father nodded. He put his hat back on. He picked up her bag before she could, the way he had always picked up her bag before she could, since she was small, and he turned toward the wagon, and Diana fell into step beside him. Papa, she said. He said. I need you to get that box out from under my bed tonight, the one with the land survey documents. He glanced at her sideways. Those old records from the county file. Those ones, she said. I wasn't finished with them when I left. I need to finish. He was quiet for a few steps. You think you found something? I think I found something, Diana said. I need to be sure. James Thornton was quiet for a moment more in the way of a man reorganizing his understanding of a situation, and then he said simply, I'll have it on the table when you get in. Diana nodded. She looked at the familiar street, the familiar storefronts, the familiar angle of the light on the familiar dust of a town that had known her all her life and thought it knew her business. She felt the gazes, a few, not many, but present from the people who registered her arrival and the information it represented. She did not drop her eyes. She was home. She was still standing, and there was work to do. The box was on the table, exactly as her father had promised. Diana set down her bag and washed her hands and sat down in front of it before she'd even taken off her coat, because some things don't wait, and she had been waiting long enough. The 3 survey documents were inside, folded and labeled in her own handwriting from 6 months ago, and she spread them flat on the table and weighted the corners with the salt cellar and the coffee tin and the lamp and her father's ledger book, and she looked at them in the lamplight and felt the particular focused calm that came over her whenever she was doing the work she was actually good at. Her father sat across from her and said nothing. He understood after 26 years of knowing his daughter that she needed quiet when she was reading something important. He poured himself coffee and he let her work. It took her an hour and 15 minutes. The alteration was in the intermediate survey, the one filed in 1871, that nobody had looked at closely because it was an intermediate document filed between the original grant and Pratt's deed, and therefore appeared to be simply a routine update. But routine updates don't change the cardinal bearing of a boundary line by 4 degrees. 4 degrees across the distance in question produced a shift in the physical boundary of almost exactly 40 yards. And the handwriting of the bearing notation, she had compared it twice now, then a third time, to be certain, was not the same handwriting as the rest of the document. The ink was a slightly different color, which could be age or could be a different bottle. The lettering was more deliberate, more carefully formed, the way lettering looks when someone is trying to make it match something and is concentrating on the effort. Someone had changed that document. And then Pratt's deed had been recorded against the changed document, and 40 yards of Thornton land had simply ceased on paper to belong to the Thorntons. Diana sat back in her chair. "Papa," she said. He looked up. He had been watching her, she realized, for the last 20 minutes, tracking the progress of whatever she was finding in her face. Pratt's deed was recorded against a falsified survey, Diana said. She kept her voice even because the evenness was important right now. She needed to be clear, not heated. The 1871 intermediate document. Someone altered the bearing notation on the eastern boundary line. 4 degrees. It moved the line 40 yards west of where the original grant places it. Her father was very still. "You're sure?" he said. It was not a question. It was the thing people say when they need to hear it, confirmed a second time before they let themselves believe it. "I'm sure," Diana said. "I can show you exactly where the notation was changed. The handwriting doesn't match the rest of the document, and the ink is different. It won't survive a comparison by anyone who knows what they're looking at." James Thornton sat with that for a long moment. His jaw was tight. She could see him working through it, the 6 years of arguments and fence lines and survey marker disputes, the money spent on a lawyer in Reno who had concluded without looking at the intermediate document that the matter was probably not worth the cost of litigation. 6 years of his land being taken from him, one small increment at a time, by a man who had falsified a government document and bet correctly that no one would look closely enough to catch it. "Pratt," her father said in a voice that was very quiet. "Yes," Diana said. "He's been out there." He stopped. 6 years, Diana said. "I know." Her father stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she let him have the moment, because he needed it, because he was a man who had just discovered that something he'd known was wrong, had been wrong in a way that was also a crime, and the anger of that was a large thing to hold in a body. "We'll need to go to the county recorder's office," Diana said, "with all 3 documents. They'll need to be examined officially. And we'll need a lawyer, not the one in Reno, someone who knows the land law in this county specifically. There's a man in Carson City." She stopped. She thought of Caleb. "You can write to me." He'd said it with the intention of following through. "There's someone I can write to," Diana said. "Someone who knows people in the county legal system. He can point us to the right person." Her father turned around. He looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, the anger still there, but underneath it, something else. Something that was working to right itself like a man finding his footing after a long time off balance. "Who?" he said. "A man I met on the train," Diana said. "His name is Caleb Xavier. He runs a ranch outside Carson City. He offered to help if I needed someone who knew the right people in the county." She paused. "He's a good man, Papa. He's honest." Her father looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and did not qualify anything she'd said, because there was nothing to qualify. Caleb Xavier was a good man and he was honest, and her father could take that assessment or leave it, but she was not going to soften it. "All right," her father said. "Write to him." She wrote the letter that night after supper by lamplight at the kitchen table. She wrote it plainly and completely, the documents. What she'd found, the nature of the alteration, what she believed the legal argument was. She told him she was in need of a recommendation for a lawyer who knew deed law in the county, and who would take a woman's research seriously without requiring her to have a man presented on her behalf. She told him her father would be present for all official proceedings, but that she intended to present the findings herself, because she had done the work and understood it better than anyone else would. She signed it, Diana Thornton, Rawhide, Nevada, and sealed it and addressed it to Caleb Xavier, care of the Carson City Post Office. And in the morning, she sent it with her youngest brother, who was going into town anyway, with instructions to post it first thing. Then she went and talked to her mother. Eleanor Thornton was in the kitchen when Diana found her doing the thing she always did when she was anxious, unnecessary, but productive work. In this case, reorganizing the shelves, she reorganized every time something was wrong. She was 53 years old, and she still had the straight spine and the quick hands of a younger woman, and she did not turn around immediately when Diana came into the kitchen, and the not turning around told Diana everything she needed to know about what her mother had been carrying. "Mama," Diana said. Her mother turned then. Her face was composed in the way of a woman who has prepared herself for a difficult conversation, which meant she'd been expecting this, and had decided on a direction for it. Diana recognized the expression. She had inherited it somewhat, though she hoped she used it more honestly. "Diana," her mother said, "sit down." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Diana had done her schoolwork at 7 and learned her first set of account books at 14, and her mother folded her hands in front of her and looked at them for a moment, and then looked up. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor Thornton said. She said it directly without preamble, which was also something Diana had inherited. "What I wrote in that letter was wrong. I should have asked you what happened before I said anything at all, and I didn't, and I've been ashamed of that since the morning it went in the post." Diana looked at her mother. "Why didn't you ask me?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid of what you'd tell me," she said. "I was afraid that if I heard the full truth of it, I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And I couldn't stand that feeling. So I reached for an explanation I could manage." "That explanation put the fault on me," Diana said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I know it did." She did not look away. "Tell me what happened, all of it. I'm asking now." So Diana told her. Start to finish, without omission and without dramatization, because the plain facts were dramatic enough on their own, and she didn't need to ornament them. She told her about the Tuesday afternoon and Preston's face moving through those expressions, and the word hysterical, and the ring placed on the mantelpiece without throwing it, without raising her voice, because she had behaved with more dignity than the situation required of her, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She told her about the 3 days in St. Louis, and the notes canceling engagements, and the visit from Preston's aunt, with the smile that never touched her eyes. Her mother listened. She did not interrupt. When Diana finished, Eleanor Thornton sat very still for a long moment, and in that stillness, Diana could see her mother doing what Eleanor Thornton did best, reorganizing her understanding of events with the focused intelligence she rarely showed, because she had learned over 53 years to keep it quiet, which was its own kind of crime. "He told people you caused a scene," Eleanor said. "Yes," Diana said. "He told people I was unstable and difficult, and had made unfounded accusations." "And Clara Beaumont was there when it happened and said nothing publicly," Diana said. Because saying something publicly would have cost her more than it cost her to stay quiet. I understand that, even if I don't admire it. Her mother looked at her daughter for a long time. You didn't cause a scene, she said. No, Diana said. I didn't. You removed the ring and left. Yes, and then Eleanor stopped. And then something in her face changed. Not dramatically, not in the way faces change in stories when a character has a revelation. In the quiet, almost imperceptible way that real people shift when something fundamental reorganizes itself underneath everything else. I should have known better than to believe his family's account without asking you, she said. I've known you your whole life. I know what kind of woman you are. Yes, Diana said. You do. I'm sorry, Eleanor said again, and this time it was different from the first time. The first time had been a prepared statement, and this was the real thing, the version that cost something to say. I know, Diana said. I believe you. She paused. It's going to take me a little time, Mama, but I believe you. Her mother nodded. She unfolded her hands and reached across the table and put one of them over Diana's, briefly the way she had when Diana was small and frightened of things she hadn't yet learned to face. Then she stood and went back to the shelves she'd been reorganizing, and Diana watched her go and thought that some repairs were not made in a single conversation, but were begun in one, and beginning was enough for now. Caleb's reply came 12 days later. Diana was at the kitchen table with the survey documents when her brother dropped the letter in front of her, and she picked it up and looked at the handwriting on the outside plain practical. Exactly what she would have expected, and she set down her pencil and opened it. He had found her a lawyer. His name was Thomas Garrett. He'd practiced land law in Nevada for 20 years. He had handled 3 deed fraud cases in this county alone, and he was... Caleb wrote not the kind of man who requires a woman to stand behind her father while someone else explains her own work. He'd taken the liberty of writing to Garrett himself and describing the situation in general terms. Garrett was willing to meet. Then below the formal information, the handwriting changed slightly, not much, but enough to signal the shift from practical communication to something more direct. I've been thinking about those surveys since Carson City. 4 degrees is not an accident, and you know it as well as I do. Pratt knew exactly what he was doing, and he bet on no one looking closely enough. He bet wrong. I hope Garrett can put that argument in front of the right people, and I have every reason to believe he can. There was a line beneath that, and then I'd like to know how it goes if you're willing to write. I find I've thought about Rawhide more than I expected to these past weeks. Caleb Xavier. Diana read the letter twice. She set it down and picked up her pencil and went back to the survey documents for another 20 minutes, and then she set the pencil down again and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began her reply. Thomas Garrett came to Rawhide 3 weeks later. He was a compact, deliberate man in his late 40s who shook Diana's hand first when he came through the door before her father's, which told her immediately that Caleb had described the situation accurately. He sat at the kitchen table, and Diana walked him through the documents in the order she'd assembled them, and he asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers. And at the end of it, he sat back and looked at the 3 surveys and said, Miss Thornton, this is one of the clearest cases of deed fraud I have seen in 20 years of practice. Her father made a sound that was not quite a word. The altered notation is obvious once you know to look for it, Garrett said. The ink differentiation alone would be sufficient to raise serious questions, and the bearing discrepancy is not the kind of error that occurs naturally in a survey of this type. Someone changed this document deliberately, and the beneficiary of that change was Gideon Pratt. He folded his hands on the table. I want to take this to the county recorder's office within the week, and I want to file a formal complaint with the land office in Carson City simultaneously. I would recommend your daughter present the documents herself with you present as the landowner of record. That's what I intend, Diana said before her father could respond. Garrett looked at her. Good, he said simply. You'll need to walk them through each document in the order you walked me through them. Don't let them rush you. You understand this material better than anyone in that office will, and they need to know that. I know, Diana said. The proceedings at the county recorder's office took the better part of a morning. Diana stood at the counter and laid out the documents and presented the findings in the same clear sequential order she had used with Garrett. And she did not let them rush her, and she did not apologize for knowing what she was talking about. And she did not defer to her father, when the clerk, a man who had clearly not expected to be taught anything today, looked past her to James Thornton twice, before Garrett quietly redirected his attention to Diana. The formal investigation into the 1871 document was opened that afternoon. Gideon Pratt. When he was informed by the county that his deed was under review for fraud, retained a lawyer from Reno who arrived in Rawhide 2 weeks later and spent a day with the documents, and then told Pratt something that Diana did not witness but heard about through Henry Alcott, which meant she heard about it accurately, that the case against the original survey was not defensible, and that Pratt ought to consider whether his best course of action involved a negotiated settlement rather than a proceeding he was unlikely to survive intact. Pratt chose the negotiated settlement. The 40 yards were restored to Thornton land in a document filed with the county recorder on a Tuesday morning in November, with Diana's name listed alongside her father's as the party who had identified and presented the evidence because Garrett had insisted on it and Diana had let him insist. She wrote to Caleb that same evening. She had been writing to him regularly by then, not every week, but often enough that his letters had become part of the rhythm of her life in a way she had stopped pretending not to notice. He wrote about the ranch, about the north pasture, about a problem with the second herd and how Ruiz had solved it. He wrote about a storm that had taken part of the barn roof and what it had cost to repair it. He wrote simply and directly and without performance the same way he spoke, and Diana wrote back in kind about the survey proceedings, about her father's gradual unbending about her mother, and the slow, imperfect work of that repair. About the account books which she had reorganized completely, and which were now, she wrote, in better shape than they had been in 10 years. About riding out to the eastern boundary for the first time after the settlement, and standing in the 40 yards of reclaimed land in the early morning, and feeling something she didn't have an exact word for, but that was close to what she imagined justice felt like when it was personal. Caleb's reply to that letter was longer than usual. He wrote about May, more than he had on the train, about the specific quality of what he'd lost, and what had eventually grown back in its place, different in character, but not in value. He wrote about loneliness honestly, the way he wrote about everything. He wrote that the ranch was large enough for a person to feel the edges of it keenly in the evenings when the work was done and the quiet came in. And then he wrote, "I find myself wondering whether you've ever thought about seeing Carson City in the spring. The land is different then. I think you might find it worth the trip." Diana read that sentence 3 times. She set the letter down and looked at the kitchen table and thought about a train car in the middle of the Nevada desert, and a man who had sat down beside her, not because he'd known who she was or what she needed, but simply because there was a seat and he was heading somewhere, and so was she. She thought about what Caleb had told her on the train. Let them keep their story. Go ahead and live. Give them something worth watching instead. She had done that. She had come home with nothing but her own capability and her grandmother's advice about balance sheets, and the particular unspectacular stubbornness of a woman who knows what she is, even when the world is busy deciding otherwise. She had done the work. She had built something back that was sturdier than what had been there before, because it was built on what was actually true, rather than what was expected. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. She wrote, "I have thought about it. I think spring would suit me very well." She sealed the letter. She addressed it. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen of her family's ranch in the house where she'd been born, at the table where she'd learned to read numbers and be honest about what they said. And she thought about a cowboy from Wyoming who had counted out the cost of a train ticket and sat down beside her when she had nothing left and called her by her name like it was something worth saying. She was not the woman who had boarded that train in St. Louis. That woman had believed her value was determined by the story other people chose to tell about her. This woman knew better. This woman had 40 yards of reclaimed land and a set of account books in better shape than they'd been in a decade, and a letter in her hand addressed to a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. The shame that had boarded the train with her in St. Louis had not survived the journey. Diana Thornton had. And that, in the end, was the only story that mattered.